So as I said, I've introduced myself, and the kind of the talk is around diet, nutrition, and aplastic anemia. Just see if I can get this moving. Perfect. So going to talk a little bit about why nutrition is important, the importance of a balanced diet, the food groups. Some of this may be very simplistic to some people who know quite a lot about diet, but I suppose it's just good to get that kind of baseline information there, just in case anyone isn't aware. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about eating well following a stem cell transplant, eating with neutropenia, and eating with steroids and other medications that you may be on as part of your treatment. Sorry, it's just a little bit slow to move. Sorry, Sam, I'm clicking, but not getting a... Will I try again? Oh, okay. So I suppose, why is nutrition important as part of your disease management? It's important to maintain the body's stores of nutrients. It's important to maintain weight during your treatment. And the reason it's important to maintain weight during your treatment is even if you are overweight or obese, when you're having things like chemotherapy or having a stem cell transplant, people tend not to lose fat. They actually tend to lose muscle. And the loss of muscle can make them feel a bit weaker. It can affect their mobility. It can affect their ability to get infections if you're not as muscular as you could potentially be. So irregardless of whether or not you are overweight, obese, a healthy weight, we very much focus on maintaining someone's weight and maintaining their strength, maintaining their energy as part of the sort of stem cell transplant or chemotherapy process. We try and prevent and reverse nutritional deficiencies with nutrition. If you're have a good nutritional status, it helps the immune system to function more effectively, which obviously you may need a bit of support with if you are immunosuppressed. It helps maximize quality of life, and enjoying food is a really important part of life. So it's important to try and make that as possible for people, even if they are having issues in terms of side effects that are affecting their ability to eat. So again, sorry, just a little bit of slowness here with the clicking. Sorry. In terms of what kind of healthy eating encompasses, it encompasses sort of the 5 food groups. The food groups are starchy carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables, kind of milk and dairy products, kind of protein foods such as meats, fish, nuts, eggs, and then also oils and other kind of foods that we kind of classify as unhealthy, so sweets, chocolates, etc., which are still part of a healthy diet, but just in smaller amounts. And kind of healthy eating is all about eating the right amounts of food, providing the right kind of nutrients you need to protect your health during treatment, enjoying your food, and obviously if appetite is affected, having more of those foods that are considered unhealthy in order to maintain your weight and maintain your strength and maintain your energy levels. And then it's always important to try and include all the foods from the food groups in your diet where possible. So yeah, fruits and vegetables, why they're important is because they're a good source of vitamins, minerals, fiber, phytochemicals. We always look at, who are the people who live the longest, who are the people less likely to get diabetes, heart disease, etc. And it always comes back to eating the most fruits and vegetables. So it is a really important part of life and part of diet to try and get as much variety into your diet as possible. However, if you are struggling to eat, fruits and vegetables do have quite a lot of fiber in them. They make you feel full quite easily. They do give you minerals and vitamins, but they don't give you energy and protein. And in that sort of short period of time where you're struggling to eat, you may be told actually they're not that important right now. They're more important for the whole of life as opposed to this kind of short period of time where you're not eating very well. So that may be why it might be a time where you eat less fruits or vegetables. Then potatoes, breads, rice, pasta, other starchy carbs, they're a good source of energy, fiber, calcium, iron, B vitamins. We advise people generally who are well to choose whole grain varieties where they can. But if you have probably issues with your bowels, if you're having too much diarrhea, you may be advised to choose white versions, or if you've had some sort of surgery, you may be asked to choose kind of white versions as well. And again, if you do feel quite full easily, brown bread, brown rice might make you feel full quicker. So if you're trying to get more food into your body, choosing the white options might be the better option for you at that time. Then dairy and alternatives, a very important source of calcium for bone health, good source of protein, vitamin A, vitamin 12. There's quite a lot of goodness in milk and dairy products. In terms of choosing low fat options, that is what's written on the slide. I'm not so strict on low fat actually. I feel like if you eat full fat ones but just have them in smaller amounts, that's just as fine as eating the low fat varieties. And that's because sometimes, particularly with yogurt, they add a lot of sugar to the low fat versions to kind of improve the taste. That's not always the case. There are very low fat yogurts out there like Fage, Fage, and a couple of other ones where there isn't that much carbohydrate or extra sugar added to them. But taste wise, they don't always taste best to me anyway. But some people are able to tolerate them. But yeah, I'm personally not very strict on low fat. It's just about kind of not having too much of the full fat versions. If you is that you prefer the full fat, but low fat is also fine. And we kind of advise to aim for 3 portions a day. If you do have any kind of lactose intolerance or you don't like drinking milk, etc., majority of brands such as Alpro, etc., do add calcium and vitamin D to their products. So they're also fine to have and they're a good source of calcium. You won't get as much protein from the alternatives or as much calories from the alternatives. Soya tends to be the best option if you are worried about your nutrients because that one, soya milk does have protein and it does have calories in it. So that would be the better option to choose. And I do tell people to kind of be cautious around switching just to organic, and that is because the organic ones don't have the nutrition, the calcium and vitamin D added to them. So it's better to choose the non-organic versions if you've completely eliminated dairy from your diet, just to ensure that you're still getting plenty of calcium and vitamin D. Then the other kind of meats and protein sources, that's beans, fish, pulses, eggs, etc. We need these because of protein and also because of iron. Kind of say to aim for at least 2 portions of fish a week, including a portion of oily fish, because that's been shown to have quite a lot of benefits for your long-term health. With processed meats and red meats, there's quite a lot of talk about them at the moment in terms of cancer risk. I generally tend to tell people red meat up to twice a week is okay for your health. And then processed meat, I would try and limit to like once a week. But again, if you're going through a period of time where you're not eating very well, and these are the foods that you like, it's absolutely okay for a short period of your life to eat more of these foods if that's what is giving you the right calories and the right protein that your body needs at that moment in time. And then oils and spreads, they're high in calories and can contribute to weight gain, which can be useful, obviously, if you are struggling to maintain your weight. I would recommend kind of olive would be sort of the sort of best oil to use in terms of cooking. Rapeseed is also quite good as well. I also say butter is fine to include in your diet as long as you're not having it in excessive amounts. It's when you're having very, very large quantities of it that becomes bad in terms of your cholesterol. If you can have less of the oil or the butter, it doesn't really matter as much what one you're choosing to use. It's all about kind of keeping the volume sort of low. But again, if you are struggling to eat, having more oil and more butter in your food may help you maintain your weight, which is important. And I would use quite a lot of oil myself in my own diet, olive oil especially, just because I do think there's quite a lot of benefits associated with it. So olive, I suppose, would be my first choice, or kind of rapeseed following that. And then it's generally fine to have an occasional drink of alcohol, but as with most things, only in moderation. You may be, depending on the kind of drug you're on, be told specific advice about not having alcohol or having alcohol. So just always check with your doctor if you're on a particular medication, just to ensure that it is safe for you to drink. If you are trying to gain weight, also Bailey's is an excellent choice. Because it's got quite a lot of calories in it. So that could be a good one to have if you are allowed to have a tipple and you are trying to gain weight. And then I suppose during your transplant, your body requires a lot more energy and protein, which a lot of people kind of struggle with because they're usually in hospital during this time. They're lying in bed most of the day, not really able to leave the room that they're in. So they kind of wonder, how does my body need all this extra energy? But it does, because your body is taking on the new cells. So really important to kind of have a high calorie, high protein diet in the sort of build up to and during a stem cell transplant. You should usually meet a dietitian in this time who would be able to advise you, but typically on units where they are being performed, you will see a lot of desserts, a lot of ice cream, a lot of protein shakes, etc. And that's because we're trying to help people maintain their weight. Depending on the type of transplant you have, some people don't really have severe symptoms with aplastic anemia and transplant, and others do. It's really quite variable how much people struggle, but the kind of typical things that can happen are nausea, vomiting, mucositis, which is ulcers in around your oral cavity, loss of appetite and taste changes. So we generally recommend a high energy, high protein diet to everyone. And then for some people, they may require more specific kind of diets, such as a liquid diet or a nasogastric feeding tube, or something called TPN, which is where you're fed through your line. But this is normally only for a short period of time during transplant. And then during chemotherapy and during a transplant, your white blood cells are reduced, which may mean that you're at higher risk of developing an infection. Kind of the main focus of today was to go through, I suppose, sort of changes that are being made to the kind of advice that we give to people around safer eating with neutropenia. We're hoping to relax the advice a little bit. And I'm kind of on the national panel who've kind of discussed these guidelines and brought them in. And kind of the main thing, I suppose, is that all food that you get in hospital should meet these guidelines or will meet these guidelines. So previously we used to tell people that they couldn't have salads in hospitals and certain foods. That will have all changed now. And most hospitals should have implemented at this stage that you should be able to have all the foods that are available in the hospital during this time. Really what we're trying to do is move away from people being worried about particular foods, but actually thinking about how they're handling your food, because that is where you're far more likely to get a food poisoning, is actually through the handling process. So for example, I used to see people peeling grapes, literally sitting there with one grape and peeling it very, very slowly because they thought that they weren't able to have fruit unless it was peeled. And then I could see the same person going to Lidl and going to the pastry section where all the lovely pastries are out in the open and anyone can go and give them a little feel or cough on them and then walk away, and eating those pastries with no second guess because that food wasn't on the list. So really we're trying to move towards more so thinking about who's handling your food. Is it sealed? Has it been kept in the fridge properly? Because that is where the evidence shows you're far more likely to catch any kind of food poisoning. It's all around the handling of the food. So kind of the things that we're telling people to do is to avoid contaminating your food, making sure you're washing your hands, drying your hands before touching or eating anything, and same for whoever is preparing your food if it's not yourself. Try not to touch your nose or your mouth when you're preparing food. Be aware of cuts on your hands. Make sure that they're covered if you're preparing food. Do the old separate chopping boards for vegetables and for meats, especially if it's raw meat, etc. So try and avoid kind of keeping the foods all together. Try and use separate storage shelves in the fridge. Make sure that your hands are sanitized and that your chopping boards, knives, etc. are cleaned using hot water, especially if they're after touching raw meat, fish, or vegetables. Cover food properly, so use cling film, tin foil, etc. Don't leave food sitting out, or make sure that you seal food if it's kind of things like bags of nuts, etc., just to avoid air getting in. So kind of use things like little pegs to keep your food sealed. Try not to overload your fridge or freezer because this can affect the temperature of your freezer at home, making the food unsafe to eat. Make sure that you kind of defrost your food in the fridge, not at room temperature, because that can be a way to increase the risk of developing bacteria within the foods. If you're at a kind of event such as a barbecue or a buffet or kind of an event at home such as like a Sunday lunch where food is being shared, be careful about shared utensils. Maybe if the person who's neutropenic would be the first person to take their food so that there's not a lot of cross-contamination going on, that would be the safest way to do that. At a barbecue specifically, I suppose ideally a barbecue isn't a good way to ensure that food is really cooked through, and that's kind of what you're checking with food, is making sure that it's cooked properly, especially meat. So maybe for someone who's neutropenic, if they could have maybe the smaller little mini barbecues that you buy, have their stuff separate, and then maybe if their food could actually be cooked in the oven and then just charred on the barbecue, that could be a safe way that you could have a barbecue at home, so you still feel included, you still feel like you're getting involved. Obviously I know it's snowing at the moment, nobody's thinking about barbecues, but this is something that's come up a lot, that people feel that being neutropenic and being conscious of all these things takes away the social element of food, which is really important. So yeah, if there is a sort of a social setting, maybe you being the first person to take food rather than everyone else in the house or everyone else at the party doing it, and then everyone is having a touch of the spoons and the utensils, etc. If you're having fruits or vegetables, that's absolutely fine, but just make sure that you're avoiding any bruised ones or any ones that have damaged packages. Check use by dates, best before dates, etc. Try and keep your pets away from food preparation areas. Dogs and cats obviously can jump up on tables and have a little snoop at different kinds of food, so just make sure that they're kept away from the kitchen when you're doing any kind of food prep or food handling. Never refreeze thawed food, and avoid reheating rice. That's really really, really important. And a lot of people don't know about the dangers of reheating rice, but that's actually one of the main places where people get food poisoning is reheating rice. So try and always cook rice freshly if you can. And then you have to be kind of careful in places such as Chinese restaurants, because they will typically reheat rice, especially if it's egg fried rice, because the rice has to be boiled before it's fried. So this is a sort of a food safety risk just to be aware of. And then in the UK, you can check whether a restaurant or takeaway has 5 stars on the Food Standards website. So it's just a simple thing of you can either put in your postcode and all the restaurants and takeaways in your area will come up and what their result has been, and they're inspected quite regularly. So it's a good way of assessing whether or not the restaurant or takeaway you're going to is somewhere that has good hygiene standards. Chain restaurants tend to be very good because, say for example, McDonald's, they can't have news that their restaurant in London has got a bad review, because that affects their whole company. So they tend to have very stringent guidelines, and that's kind of seen across the board for a lot of chain restaurants. So I do feel quite confident in people eating out in chain restaurants. Their food hygiene standards tend to be very good. Then in terms of, sorry, now just changing the slide again, where the main changes are in terms of what we're advising. So we're still saying to avoid a number of high risk foods. It's very typical to pregnancy advice. So there's just a couple of foods that are not really pasteurized, where there is a little bit more risk involved, that we're telling people to avoid. So unpasteurized dairy products, which you won't really find in very many supermarkets, but could be sold in sort of local farm markets, etc. We would still say to avoid that because of the risk of TB and kind of other bacteria in unpasteurized dairy products. There is also a couple of cheeses that might not be pasteurized, like feta or parmesan. That doesn't mean that you can't have those cheeses, but typically you will have to check the packaging to see if they say that they've been pasteurized, and a lot of them will have been, but sometimes when you go to shops that are a little bit more deli style, they won't always have been pasteurized. But typically in a supermarket, a lot of these cheeses will have been pasteurized, and it's just that you need to check the packaging. There's also a couple of other cheeses like camembert, goat's cheese, etc., that may not be pasteurized. So just kind of checking that. But you will be able to find some pasteurized versions of a lot of these types of cheeses. And then hard cheddars tend to be quite safe. And then pasteurized parmesan, pasteurized mozzarella, paneer made with pasteurized milk. It's just that it may be in certain delis and kind of smaller shops that you struggle to check that they're all done. Then in terms of kind of other items to avoid, damaged, bruised, or overripe fruits or vegetables. So fruits and vegetables aren't off the chart, but just making sure that there's no damaged ones or moldy ones in a pack, which can happen. If that is the case, I would probably take out the moldy one and avoid eating all the ones that were around the moldy one, and giving everything else a good wash and kind of removing it from the packaging. That would be the sort of safest way to manage that situation. Some commercial smoothies won't have been pasteurized, or fruit juices. So again, it's just a matter of checking whether or not they have been pasteurized. Then in terms of stuffed vine leaves, fattoush, tabbouleh, alfalfa, sprouted seeds, they're kind of more unusual items, but they're just kind of things to be aware of, that those items are kind of made and stored in kind of not as safe as we would like to be environments. So they might not be suitable if you're on a neutropenic diet. Then just moving on to the next slide. So smoked meats like salami, we would say to avoid, and that's because they're raw. Any kind of shellfish like oysters, very lightly cooked mussels. Now, if they're in a risotto or in a curry, they're usually more well cooked, so that's absolutely fine. But we would just say to avoid anything that's sort of raw, and similarly with smoked meats like salami, prosciutto. We do say smoked salmon is fine, but you have to eat it fresh from the packet. So eat it on the day that the packet was opened. That's the advice around sort of smoked salmon and smoked fish. So still fine to have, but just make sure that you eat them on the day. I know that might seem quite wasteful. So if you are having smoked salmon, everyone else in the house has to agree to it, or it does have to be a very small packet. Then with regards to eggs, just making sure that they're not raw or undercooked. And then if you are out in restaurants, sometimes they will make homemade versions of products such as dressings or mayonnaises, and the eggs will not have been pasteurized. So just being cautious around eating out if you are having any kind of salad dressings, etc. And then, yeah, as well, you may need to check that around hollandaise sauce, mousses, homemade ice creams, homemade mayonnaises, etc. Shop-bought mayonnaise, hard-boiled eggs, and other products made with pasteurized eggs are all absolutely fine to have. Whilst you're neutropenic, the advice still is to avoid probiotic foods like Yakult, Actimels, Activias, and that's because they add bacteria to the product. That advice may change in the future, but it's very difficult to say whether or not those bacteria are safe for people or not. So at the moment, the advice is to sort of avoid these particular products, but any yogurt that describes itself as live is absolutely fine to have. So all yogurt technically has bacteria added to it, and as long as it doesn't say with added bacteria, it's fine for you to have these yogurts and these products. We say to avoid meat pates and vegetable pates because they're not pasteurized, but again, you may be able to find pasteurized versions in tins or jars, and these will be absolutely fine to have. Honey in the supermarkets are fine, but farm fresh honey and unpasteurized honey is something just to be aware of, and that's because of botulism. We just have to kind of give that advice because there have been rare cases where people have had honey that's not been pasteurized, and they haven't been well. And then we just generally say to avoid large packets of food items from pick and mixes. Anyone can go and have their hands in there, and just being conscious around things like carveries, delis, where foods have been sitting out for very long periods of time. Salad bars, sometimes the things like coleslaw are left out for very long periods of time. So trying to eat these sorts of foods in a more sealed environment. Sometimes some delis as well will have things like fresh hummus, but again, it's been sitting out for hours. We're not sure about how safe it is stored at night, etc. So it may be better that you can have these foods, but have the sealed versions that you can get in the supermarket if possible, or in the shop. And then just around chemotherapy and how that can affect your ability to eat. It can affect your taste. It can affect it may result in kind of oral thrush or mucositis, which I talked about earlier, which can result in difficult swallowing, dryness of mouth, pain on swallowing. It can also affect your bowel in that it causes nausea, vomiting. It completely affects your appetite. We call that anorexia, when you just have no appetite whatsoever, feeling full quite easily, having kind of reflux, having diarrhea. There's lots of ways that chemotherapy and stem cell transplants can affect your ability to eat. So please be kind on yourself if during those periods of time all you're able to manage is chalk ices or ice creams or whatever it is that gets you through. Healthy eating is not the goal during that period. It's maintaining your weight and overcoming these obstacles that make eating really challenging. There's a little bit of advice there around taste changes because a lot of people do struggle with that. So if you are struggling with kind of unusual tastes, we kind of have a little bit of advice there around specific issues. So it may be that you do kind of particular mouth care before you eat. Some people use baking powder and water to kind of normalize their taste buds. Some people find cold or lukewarm foods have a weaker taste than hot foods, and that's what they get on better with. If food tastes really bitter, tastes unnaturally sweet or metallic or sort of cardboard-like. We do find sometimes switching to plastic cutlery rather than metallic cutlery can help with the metallic taste. So some people may use plastic cutlery for a period. A lot of people say marinating meats, so using vinaigrettes, kind of spices, etc., can really help if you do have metallic tastes after your chemotherapy or after your treatment. And we kind of say to use a lot of stronger tasting foods if you're struggling to eat anything. So again, things like pickles, piccalilli, chutneys, these are the foods that people who may typically have had no interest in those foods all of a sudden are interested in them, and it's because their taste buds are trying to come back. So giving yourself a bit of a boost and adding more flavor to foods can really help if you are struggling in terms of taste, and adding lots of herbs, spices, garlic, onions, all those sort of strong flavored foods. Adding more fat to food because oils actually carry flavor, so maybe adding a little bit of olive oil onto food or adding a little bit of butter into food can help with the taste a little bit. And then just making sure that your mouth is okay and you're not struggling with thrush, etc., because that is quite common post-treatment, and that is a major barrier to tasting and eating properly. There's just a little bit about nausea and vomiting as well. Eating little and often, that can help. So grazing rather than facing into big meals, because big meals can feel very overwhelming. Trying to eat bland and cold foods that have less of an aroma can feel less overwhelming. A lot of people struggle with greasy, spicy, or really sweet foods, so kind of going for the plainer options. Some people find ginger quite helpful if they're nauseous, so ginger biscuits, crystallized ginger, ginger ale can help a little bit with taste issues as well. And then if you are really struggling with having absolutely no interest in eating whatsoever and feeling full quite easily, there are some medications that you can ask to take. And there are some appetite stimulants we can also suggest, such as steroids, etc. But it would be the same advice as what I'm giving in terms of nausea and vomiting, which would be little and often, choosing plain foods, choosing high calorie, high protein foods, and then kind of speaking to your medical team if it's an ongoing issue to see if there's any way that they can support you. And then in terms of multivitamins and supplements, this isn't something we typically recommend if you've got a fairly decent diet. And a lot of people kind of wonder, oh, what sort of multivitamins should I be taking? And I suppose long term, it's not something I necessarily advise. And that's because whenever they've tried to make people healthier by giving them vitamin C tablets or multivitamin tablets, the evidence has never been great. And it kind of, the overall sort of picture is that by just having a good variety in diet, and the food itself is better than actually taking supplements. So that's kind of where we tend to advise people. But obviously, if you're having a period where your appetite is really bad, and you're not getting the right mixture of foods, we might recommend a multivitamin. Vitamin D is sort of the exception to the rule, particularly for anyone who's not getting a lot of sunlight. So I think at the moment the advice is that during the winter periods we should all be taking vitamin D. I'm not sure how well people follow that advice, but it's definitely important if you've been on any long courses of steroids, because that can affect your bone health. So taking vitamin D might be a really important thing for your overall health in those particular cases. Then in terms of steroids, this is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Some people obviously could get concerned about weight gain when they're on steroids. So if that is an issue for you, a lot of it is very what you would expect, but this sort of plate is for people who are trying to lose weight or not gain any more weight, and it's kind of where your food should sit. So what we typically tell people is to reduce the amount of starchy carbs that they have, choose brown rather than white, and then have more vegetables and more protein on their plate, and just kind of focusing more on filling up on vegetables and filling up on protein, and that will kind of hopefully help with the overeating. If you are struggling, as well, other things you can do are kind of limiting takeaways to once a week, because the calories in takeaways can be quite high. Avoiding fizzy drinks and juice, because that's actually where a lot of people pick up extra calories, and they don't necessarily notice it because they're not sitting down and having a meal. If you are having snacks, choosing fruit, nuts, boiled eggs, protein yogurts or puddings, which you can get in a lot of the supermarkets now, like Lidl or Aldi, or hummus is a good snack, rather than kind of going to sweets, chocolates, etc. And then making sure that you're taking care of your bones, as I said, if you're on steroids. So making sure that your diet is high in calcium and that you're taking a vitamin D supplement, but also just being kind to yourself. If you do put on a little bit of weight while you're on steroids, that is kind of part of the plan. And obviously everyone is individual. Everyone may have individual reasons why they're struggling to lose weight post steroids, and obviously this disease is quite complex, so just be kind to yourself as well. As long as the weight gain isn't extreme, it could be something that you lose in the future when you are feeling healthier, when you are able to mobilize more, because you probably are on steroids for a reason and you might not be feeling very well in yourself. So kind of being balanced about the whole thing on the whole. And then just a little bit about L-Thromabag. A lot of patients are on L-Thromabag and it causes a little bit of problems in terms of dairy. I haven't given exact advice about when you're allowed to have dairy, because I found that it varies from center to center, but a lot of people are told that they can't have dairy 2 hours before or 2 hours after they have their L-Thromabag. And a lot of people take it at breakfast time, so that sort of limits them. So just trying to, if you are on L-Thromabag, make sure that you're getting dairy products later in the day. And a lot of people don't realize as well that they have soya milk or something instead if they've been told to avoid dairy products. But a lot of the Alpro products have calcium added to them, or a lot of any of the supermarket products that are dairy alternatives. And it's actually calcium that interacts with the L-Thromabag. So the main thing is to avoid calcium. So just if you are choosing an alternative around the time that you're having the L-Thromabag, make sure that it's not one that's added calcium in it, because it'll have the same impact as dairy will, and it'll affect the capacity of the L-Thromabag to work. A lot of people don't get that advice from pharmacy, so just good to be aware. But you may hear different advice about how long you need to avoid dairy depending on your pharmacy. So I just didn't want to give exact requirements, because everywhere gives slightly different advice. And then if you are struggling with eating, if you're losing or gaining significant amounts of weight or having experienced prolonged side effects, please ask to be referred to a dietitian. I know it varies from center to center how available dietitians are, and I know if you are on the transplant pathway, it tends to be easier to see a dietitian. It probably is quite challenging to see one otherwise, but you should be able to access one, even if there is a long waiting list as part of your hematology centre. There should be access to a specialist dietitian. So just do ask if you do have any specific concerns. I would base it solely on the neutrophil count, but I would maybe for everyone with aplastic anemia always be cautious of the really high risk situations, such as pick and mixes, foods which are out in the open, because that's where people mostly catch food poisoning, and then I suppose dodgy takeaways and things like that. So I think always be on alert with regard to that when you do have a condition like aplastic anemia. But the more specific advice around pates, etc., really comes into force when your neutrophil count is low. But yeah, the other kind of more general advice about food safety is we probably all should be following it, I suppose. You would wonder how many people have caught conditions or norovirus or things from things like open pastry aisles and different things like that. Does that make sense? So where that comes from is you're not alone in your struggle with the grapefruit. So actually anyone who's on cholesterol lowering medication can't have grapefruit, a particular type, and anyone who's on retroviral drugs for HIV can also not have grapefruit. And it's just a sort of a natural enigma that there's a particular chemical that lives in grapefruit, only grapefruit, that interacts with one of the parts of the drug and makes the drug not work well. So there's actually a whole list of drugs that grapefruit interact with. There is no other food in the world that does this except for grapefruit. But yeah, unfortunately, whilst you're on these drugs, grapefruit is a big no-no. But you'll find it's quite a common affliction. There's quite a whole list of drugs that it gets affected by. There's